Imagine this: you're chained to the ground, the rough stone digging into your skin as the hot sun beats down on you. Your body is sore from the grueling hours of forced labor, but the real pain is coming. You hear the crowd, a roar rising up from the stands, and you know, it's not for you. It's for what's about to happen. The sounds of iron and chains clinking around you seem distant as your eyes lock onto the massive lion moving toward you, its jaws snapping, eyes fixed on you like a predator sensing its prey. The tension in the air is thick, almost suffocating. You know there's no way out, no chance to run. The soldiers stand nearby, their eyes cold, ready to make sure there's no escape. This isn't a battle for survival. This isn't a fight to protect your life or your family. No, this is something much darker. This is a Roman arena, a place where your life isn't worth more than the entertainment value you provide. The crowd's roar only grows louder as you struggle to take in your last breaths of air, feeling the weight of the chains around your limbs, the blood rushing to your head. And then it hits you: this is the moment you were born for in their eyes. A moment to die for their amusement. The emperor is watching. And for him, this is just another show, another brutal display of power to remind everyone who's in charge. For you, this is the end. But not just your end. It's the end of countless others who've walked into this arena before you, each fighting not for freedom, but for sport, to please those in the stands who cheer for bloodshed. As the lion inches closer, you can't help but think, did anyone ever really stand a chance here? In this fight, the only thing that's certain is that it's not about winning. It's about dying, gruesome, public, and unforgettable. And for some, like you, it will be a death they never saw coming, no matter how much they fought to survive. The game's already decided. The gladiatorial games didn't start as the blood-soaked, mass spectacles we think of today. They began as something much more private, a way for Roman families to honor the dead. In the early days of the Roman Republic, when the city was still small and its traditions were taking shape, a gladiatorial contest was seen as an offering to the deceased. At a wealthy man's funeral, his family would organize a fight between two pairs of slaves, sometimes even among the men who had worked on his land or served in his house. These combats, though deadly, were meant to be an act of respect, a form of ritual sacrifice, where the blood spilled was intended to honor the life of the one who had passed. But over time, these private rituals began to take on a new form. They were no longer just about honoring the dead, but about creating a spectacle that drew the attention of the masses. What began as small-scale contests among slaves quickly grew into something far grander, something that could captivate not just a handful of mourners but an entire city. The first recorded gladiatorial games were held in 264 BC, at the funeral of a Roman noble named Decimus Junius Brutus. The intention was to honor his father, but the outcome was far more than anyone expected. Thousands turned up, eager to witness the strange and violent new form of entertainment. At first, these games were a mark of status, an indication of wealth and power. The more pairs of gladiators you could offer, the more respect you earned. They were held in private, at funerals or during other important ceremonies, with the fights taking place in temporary arenas or just in the open air. However, as the games grew in popularity, the political elite saw an opportunity to use them as a tool of power. By the late Republic, gladiatorial games weren't just for the dead. They were for the living, and they were no longer a symbol of wealth, but of political ambition. As Rome expanded and conquered more territories, the gladiatorial games began to evolve. No longer confined to funerals, they became massive public events designed to keep the population entertained. Rome's leaders realized that providing bloodshed was not just a way to show power but a way to pacify the people, to control them through spectacle. These events allowed the ruling class to appease the masses, especially when food was scarce or unrest was growing. Bread and circuses, the phrase attributed to the poet Juvenal, became the formula for keeping the Roman population content. The state was handing out free entertainment, keeping the people distracted from the more pressing issues like poverty, corruption, and the growing political chaos. With emperors like Julius Caesar, Augustus, and later, Nero, the gladiatorial games went from a symbol of prestige to the defining feature of public entertainment. Leaders knew that hosting grand games, sometimes lasting for days, would cement their popularity. It wasn't enough to put on a simple fight between a few men. Now, entire armies of gladiators, wild beasts, and even naval battles would be staged to wow the crowds. These spectacles were designed to be more than fights. They were performances, a carefully choreographed display of violence, with each match more brutal than the last. Emperors began holding these events not just to honor the gods or the dead, but to show their power, to ensure that they were the center of attention. The games gave them a platform to demonstrate their wealth, their control, and their connection to the people. By the time the empire was at its peak, the games had taken on a life of their own. Gladiators, once lowly slaves or criminals, became celebrities, idolized by the public, their names whispered among the crowds. The arenas were no longer just places for honor or political strategy, they became something more, sites of mass entertainment. For the citizens of Rome, they were a way to escape the mundanity of daily life, a chance to witness violence on a scale they could not imagine in their own worlds. For the emperors, the games became a tool of control, a distraction from the failings of government and the empire itself. But there was another side to the games, one that became harder to ignore. What started as a form of ritual sacrifice soon transformed into an industry of death. Gladiators were no longer fighting for honor, they were fighting for their lives. The battles became more brutal, the risks greater. Many of the gladiators were prisoners of war, criminals, or slaves, men and women who were forced into the arena to face death for the entertainment of the public. Their lives were worth little more than the sport they provided. The violence became more staged and more spectacular, with elaborate reenactments of famous battles, mock naval combat, and fights to the death against exotic animals like lions, tigers, and even elephants. These acts weren't just violent, they were designed to shock, to elicit a primal response from the crowd. But the real brutality came with the way the Roman people viewed it. What started as an act of ritual honor had evolved into a public spectacle so violent that it blurred the line between entertainment and execution. People didn't just watch these games for the thrill of combat, they watched because it was a celebration of death. It became so ingrained in Roman culture that even the most educated and philosophically minded citizens turned a blind eye to the horrors happening in the arena. The games had become a symbol of Roman identity. The brutality was woven into the very fabric of Roman life, so much so that the spectacle of human suffering was no longer questioned. The gladiatorial games had evolved from small-scale rituals to the most gruesome form of entertainment the world had ever seen. What started with just a handful of men fighting for the dead eventually claimed thousands, as emperors and politicians vied to outdo each other in cruelty. The people of Rome craved blood, and the gladiatorial arena provided it by the gallon. And as the blood flowed, so too did the empire's moral compass, slowly eroding until the very idea of life and death became just another game, played for the amusement of the masses. The gladiatorial games were not content with simple sword fights. What began as mere duels for survival quickly escalated into a twisted spectacle designed to push the boundaries of human endurance and cruelty. As the crowds grew louder, so did the demand for bloodier, more dramatic acts. The Roman emperors, always eager to keep the masses entertained, began to experiment with darker forms of violence, pushing gladiators and animals alike to their limits. Soon, gladiators weren't just fighting each other, they were forced to face wild animals. Lions, tigers, and bears were brought into the arena, starved for days, and then unleashed onto the doomed fighters. It was no longer about skill or strength, it was about survival, pure and simple. The fighters were outmatched, outclassed, and often outnumbered, but the audience wanted a show. The animals were ferocious, the gladiators desperate. Each fight felt like a countdown to death, as the poor men struggled to fight back against beasts that were faster, stronger, and more deadly than anything they had ever faced. But the cruelty didn't end there. The Romans, always craving bigger and more extravagant displays, introduced even more horrifying spectacles. Mock naval battles, where gladiators would be forced to fight in flooded arenas, reenacting ancient wars with real ships and real combat. Thousands of men, criminals, and prisoners of war were pitted against each other, often with no training, just the order to kill or be killed. The brutality of it all was mind-boggling. Imagine being thrown into a raging sea, surrounded by enemies, fighting for your life in a ship that was sinking by design. The spectators, eager for more, cheered as these men fought not just against each other but against their impending doom. As these games became more complex and twisted, the question arose, what was the real terror? Was it the beasts, the arena, or the men themselves? What if the true horror wasn't the violence enacted on the gladiators, but the way they were slowly stripped of their humanity, forced into roles they never chose and had no way to escape? It's one thing to be a slave to a master. It's another entirely to be a slave to the spectacle itself, to become nothing more than a piece in a game where your life has no value except for the entertainment you provide. And then there were the forced suicides. In a time when life was disposable, some gladiators chose to end it themselves rather than face another fight. The Roman crowds, desensitized by years of violence, started to crave even more twisted spectacles, where not only gladiators fought to the death but where the very act of choosing death, over the gladiatorial fight, was turned into a form of entertainment. This added a sickening layer to the games. It wasn't enough to simply watch men kill each other. Now, the question was, who would die by their own hand? With every battle, the brutality became more calculated, more deliberate. The violence in the arena wasn't just about physical strength. It was about pushing moral boundaries, testing what could be endured, and seeing how much death could be handled before the crowd grew bored. And for the fighters, the arena became a hell where no one left unscathed. For every gladiator that survived, another one would take their place, always another fighter, always another death. In the midst of all this brutality, there were men, real men, with hopes, fears, and families, each of them thrust into the arena for reasons that were as diverse as the fights themselves. Take Marcus, for example, a man who was once a simple farmer, now thrust into the heart of the Colosseum. He didn't ask for this life. He had no choice. His family was starving, and when the empire calls, you answer, or you die. Marcus's first fight was supposed to be a way to survive, an opportunity to earn his freedom, perhaps even his dignity. But that hope quickly withered as he stood in the arena, staring across at another man, a fellow slave, both of them armed only with swords and shields, facing each other for the amusement of thousands. This wasn't a fair fight. Marcus knew it, and his opponent knew it. The fight wasn't about skill or bravery, it was about obedience. Fight, or die. And so, Marcus fought. But as the sweat dripped down his face and the blood of his opponent stained the sand beneath him, he realized something. The real battle wasn't the one in the arena, it was the fight within himself, the struggle against a system that saw him as nothing more than a tool for entertainment. Marcus wasn't the only one. All the gladiators had a story, a reason they were there. Some had been soldiers captured in battle, others criminals sentenced to death, and some, like Marcus, were just poor men trying to survive. But all of them had one thing in common. They were fighting for their lives in an arena that cared nothing for their humanity. They weren't heroes or warriors, they were expendable. Then there were the emperors, the ones who made the decisions, who ordered the spectacles, and who watched from their opulent seats as men fought for their lives. Some, like Julius Caesar, knew that the games were a way to gain favor with the masses. But others, like Nero, reveled in the brutality, using it as a way to elevate themselves above the people. To them, the games were not just a way to keep the people happy, they were a demonstration of power, a reminder that they could take life at will. The emperor's command was absolute. What he wanted, he got. If that meant pitting men against lions, so be it. If it meant forcing them to fight until they could no longer stand, so be it. But the real tragedy lay not with the rulers but with the men who fought. Gladiators were often treated as little more than animals, trained to fight and die for the entertainment of the crowd. But some of them, like Marcus, still held on to a flicker of humanity, still remembered who they were before the arena, before the chains. They fought not just to survive, but to hold on to whatever shred of their former lives they could. And the spectators? They were just as complicit. At first, it was easy to dismiss the violence as just another form of entertainment, a distraction from the harsh realities of life. But over time, the people of Rome became desensitized. They stopped seeing the men in the arena as people. They stopped caring about the blood spilled, the lives lost, the families broken. They were there to be entertained, to cheer for the death and destruction that unfolded before them. For them, the gladiators were nothing more than characters in a play where the stakes were real, but the emotions had been dulled. The gladiatorial games were not just a battle for survival, they were a battle for humanity itself. Each fight, each act of violence, chipped away at what it meant to be human. For some, like Marcus, the fight was about much more than survival. It was about trying to hold on to the person they had been before the empire had turned them into a weapon for the masses. But in the end, that fight was always stacked against them. And in the Colosseum, no one ever truly walked away unscathed. The arena, once a symbol of honor and glory, had slowly transformed into something much darker. What the crowds cheered for, what they celebrated, was not bravery or skill, it was the suffering of human beings. It was a place where men fought not for their own survival, but for the entertainment of thousands, their lives nothing more than a commodity. But the true horror wasn't just in the blood spilled, it was in the reality of who these gladiators really were. What the spectators didn't realize, however, was that many of these men were not seasoned fighters at all. They weren't warriors trained for battle or veterans of some grand campaign. Many were criminals, sentenced to death for crimes as petty as theft or defiance of Roman law. Forced into the arena to fight, these men were given no choice but to die or kill. The twist, the cruel irony of it all. They weren't even fighting for freedom. Some were promised freedom if they survived a certain number of battles. The idea was simple: survive long enough, earn your liberty. But for the vast majority of these men, that promise was a lie. In one particularly brutal spectacle, the emperor decided to stage what he called the last stand, a fight between a group of condemned criminals, forced to fight each other for survival. The crowd roared as these men, some barely able to hold a sword, were pitted against one another. The stakes were high. Whoever won, survived. But the truth behind this last stand was far darker. These men, no matter how they fought or how bravely they battled, had no chance of leaving the arena alive. The emperor, in his insatiable need for more spectacle, declared that only one man would walk out alive. And yet, despite their fight for survival, none would walk free. One of the condemned, a man named Gaius, had been sentenced to die for stealing bread to feed his starving children. The irony? He had been thrust into this death trap not because of his crimes, but because the empire saw his life as expendable, just another pawn in the emperor's grand game. He fought fiercely, not just to survive, but to prove that his life had value. But like the others, he was slaughtered, his body falling to the sands, a forgotten soul in the eyes of the crowd. And that, in itself, was the cruelest irony. The empire, which once prided itself on the value of citizenship and strength, had now become a society where the only value a man had was the violence he could provide. The demand for more dramatic, more violent spectacles grew with every passing year, and what began as gladiatorial combat soon morphed into something far more disturbing. The brutality of the arena escalated as emperors sought to outdo each other, pushing the limits of what could be seen as entertainment. And as the horrors grew, so did the empire's descent into madness. By the time of Emperor Titus's reign, no act was too extreme, no cruelty too much. The people demanded more, bigger, better, more shocking spectacles to fill the arena. And so, Titus delivered. One of the most notorious events took place when 4,000 condemned men were forced to reenact a naval battle in the flooded Colosseum. These sailors, however, were not experienced warriors or seasoned naval commanders. They were criminals, men who had been plucked from their cells and given no training, no preparation. Their only crime was being unlucky enough to be chosen for this twisted spectacle. The Colosseum was flooded to simulate a sea battle, 2 opposing fleets were constructed, and the men were shoved onto ships, forced to fight as if they were truly at war. The battle was a brutal bloodbath. Men, some of whom couldn't swim, drowned as they tried to navigate the unstable boats. Others were hacked to death by their fellow prisoners, their screams of terror and pain silenced by the roar of the crowd. The arena became a sea of blood, as the men fought not for victory, but for survival, a survival that only 1 or 2 would ever achieve, if they were lucky. The crowd, as always, cheered. For them, it didn't matter who lived or died. The blood was all that mattered. The emperor's indulgence in such horrific acts was a reflection of the empire's desperation to keep the masses entertained, to maintain their control over a population that was beginning to grow restless. The spectacle became less about combat and more about power, power over life, over death, and over the people watching from the stands. What had once been a way for Rome's elite to assert dominance over their people had now become a grotesque form of state-sanctioned murder, a ritual in which the people participated, not just as spectators, but as consumers of suffering. The Romans had created something more terrible than the gladiatorial games, a culture in which violence, death, and cruelty were no longer questioned but eagerly awaited. In these acts of escalating terror, the empire revealed its true nature, a civilization that had traded its moral compass for entertainment, where the thirst for spectacle could never be quenched. The line between life and death had become so blurred that, by the end, no one was safe, not even the emperor himself. What began as a way to honor the dead had become an all-consuming monster, demanding more blood with every passing year. And soon, that thirst would take the empire itself down, leaving behind only the echoes of its atrocities. The brutality of the Roman games, once a cornerstone of the empire's power and a symbol of the dark sides of human nature, may seem like a thing of the past. Yet, when you look closely, the appetite for spectacle and suffering is still alive today, perhaps more insidiously than ever. The arena has changed, but the desire to consume violence, to see people pushed to their limits for our amusement, remains the same. The Romans believed that they were creating unity and glory with their games, that the violence and bloodshed were necessary to maintain the strength of the empire. But in reality, they were building a monument to cruelty, a culture where human suffering was not only tolerated but celebrated. The question then becomes, have we learned anything from the past? Fast forward to today. We no longer gather in massive arenas to watch men fight to the death, but look around, our screens, our entertainment, our sports, they all carry the same undercurrent of violence and suffering. We binge-watch violent movies, TV shows, and documentaries, unable to look away from the drama, the blood, the destruction. We cheer on athletes as they push themselves to the edge of exhaustion and injury for a moment of glory, much like the gladiators of ancient Rome. Reality TV thrives on drama, conflict, and pain, manipulating human emotions for the sake of ratings. News outlets, often sensationalized, focus on tragedy, conflict, and disasters, drawing us in with their shocking headlines. And in the world of social media, viral videos of violence and suffering spread faster than ever, with people watching as if it's a game, a form of entertainment. What happened in Rome isn't gone. It's evolved. The Colosseum may have crumbled to dust, but the moral rot that it represents is alive and well. We no longer sit in a public arena, but we gather on our screens, consuming violence and drama as if it's entertainment. The real question is, are we any better? Are we really so different from the Romans, cheering from the stands, entertained by the suffering of others? It's easy to say that the violence of the past is behind us. But the truth is, we haven't changed all that much. The medium has evolved, but our hunger for spectacle, our need to witness suffering for entertainment, is still very much alive. And that's a problem that we need to address, before it consumes us, just as it consumed the Romans. As the blood-soaked floors of the Colosseum were swept clean and the survivors walked out, their bodies bruised, bloodied, and broken, they were hailed as heroes by the very people who had condemned them to die. For a fleeting moment, they were celebrated for their courage, for their ability to survive in a world that had been designed to strip them of their humanity. But what did they really win? A few more days of life? A brief escape from death only to face it again in another fight? Their moment of glory was short-lived, their victory hollow. For the rest of their lives, they would carry the scars of the arena, both physical and emotional. The audience, so eager to cheer and celebrate, never stopped to think, who were the real winners here? Was it the gladiators, the men who fought with everything they had to stay alive? Or was it the spectators, who cheered and jeered, feeding on the violence, finding pleasure in the pain of others? These gladiators, these men who fought not for glory but for survival, were pawns in a game far bigger than them. Their suffering wasn't just a momentary display, it was a product of a system that saw them as less than human, as nothing more than entertainment. And yet, in their struggles, in their fight for their lives, they showed a resilience that transcended the cruelty of the arena. They showed us what it means to hold on to your humanity when everything else is trying to take it away. We must never forget their stories, because in their stories lies the truth of our own. What does it cost us to consume violence, to watch others suffer for our amusement? What happens to us when we stop seeing people as individuals, when we only see them as performers, as players in a show designed to satisfy our thirst for entertainment? In the end, the gladiators' fight wasn't just about surviving the arena. It was about surviving the dehumanization that came with it. And as we watch our own forms of entertainment today, be it on a screen or in real life, maybe it's time for us to ask, what are we really cheering for? And at what cost? As the echoes of the Colosseum fade, let us remember that the greatest victory isn't in surviving the fight, it's in preserving our humanity in the face of the brutality that surrounds us. As we look back at the horrors of the Roman arena, we must ask ourselves, what have we really learned? The violence, the bloodshed, the cruelty. Was it just a symptom of a dying empire, or is it something that still echoes in our world today? In a society that consumes entertainment more than ever, how different are we from those ancient spectators, cheering for blood without thinking of the cost? What's more disturbing, the blood spilled in the arena, or the way we continue to consume violence in the media, in sports, in entertainment, and in the news? Are we truly different from the Romans who cheered for gladiators' lives to be thrown away for sport? And as we binge-watch violence and drama on our screens, have we become desensitized to the real-world consequences of the suffering we witness? It's time to reflect. How much longer will we allow ourselves to be numbed by the spectacle of violence? What will it take to break the cycle of desensitization? How can we hold ourselves accountable for the ways we consume suffering as entertainment? We want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the thirst for spectacle and violence is something that still exists in our culture today? And if so, how do we change it? Join the conversation and share your reflections in the comments below. What do you think could have stopped the Roman Empire's descent into cruelty? Could we be heading down a similar path? Let's think critically about how far we've come, and whether we're truly moving forward.